Welcome everyone to the Ditch the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Alana Russo. I'm a graphic designer and career and success coach who knew I could do better, but kept falling short of where I wanted to go. And now, after years of exploring personal and career development, business, money mindset, and energy work, I'm here to tell you that yes, you can move from stuck and defeated to empowered and confident. Ready to dive in? Awesome. Together, let's ditch the struggle. Hi, and welcome back. I'm going to be diving into another story from the past. Now, I will be talking about things happening to me now, but I do feel that going back to some of these key moments in my life is critical to understanding this concept of ditch the struggle, how it all began for me, and really where I started making the progress and making the changes. So I'm going to take you back to, it's March 2012. And it is a job interview story. And I really love a good job interview story because I have had some crazy ones. And now I work as a career coach. So I hear a lot of wild stories, things that you couldn't make up. And I've been through some of these. And this interview was very interesting for a few reasons. Well, it was a bank job. This was actually for RBC Dexia. It doesn't exist anymore. They got fully bought out by RBC. It was some kind of investment leg. I didn't know too much about it. I definitely didn't picture myself working for a bank. I have always really worked in like more lifestyle brands, women's brands, things like that. But a recruiter reached out to me. And her name was Linda. Linda reaches out and says, there's this job. And I still have the job description, which is crazy. I found it in my email. And it is just the title of graphic designer. Back when job titles were simpler and like easy to understand. So it was graphic designer. And it paid $90,000 a year with all the perks because it was a bank. Now, that is actually a pretty decent salary for, again, this is almost 14 years ago. And I can't tell you how many jobs I see now that pay way less than that. And then the job description has way more. They're asking for impossible things. And I know job descriptions are wish lists and you really have to look at them like that. You can't know that you're going to check every box, or you can't go in thinking you're going to check every box, and you can. It's their wish list. It's their letter to Santa saying we would love all these things. But we are getting to crazy levels of insanity with what people are expecting. But when I went through this one, it was pretty simple. So it's like graphic design campaigns, some advertising, keen eye for color and balance and textural elements. I'm pulling some of these real words. Minimum 5 years experience. At the time, I had way more than that. And understanding color theory, things like that. Adobe InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator. It did ask for Adobe After Effects, which I never really learned. I had zero interest. I still have never learned it. PowerPoint and Word. Well, every designer has to know a little bit about those, but we all know how awful PowerPoint is. It's evil. And so is Word, both awful, but you have to kind of get through it. So I decided to actually go for this job because there are times when a little bit of stability makes sense. And my husband was still pursuing his music career and working, I believe, part-time. So the deal kind of was between us that if one person was freelancing or pursuing creative pursuits, then the other one would have more of a full-time steady job. Now, that's what worked for us. And we felt that this made sense. So everyone has to do what's right for them. But so I was really leaning towards going for this job. And I was really quickly getting mesmerized by the idea of just having a steady job, a bank job. There was like a Starbucks right in the building. It has all the perks and all those things. And it's amazing how when a corporate job gets put in front of you, you can just suddenly see the money, and just feel the ease, because quite frankly, it's way easier for me to work a full-time job than to be an entrepreneur. It's way less energy, even if the job is super stressful. That's just for me. So I decided to get dressed up for this job interview. Back then, it was still hard copy portfolios. So I had my black portfolio, and I still remember what I was wearing. It was like wide leg black pants, some kind of cream blouse, so pretty conservative. And I go to the first interview, and There were two guys interviewing me, and it felt stressful. Felt pretty formal, actually. And we're sitting down at this table going through my resume, and one of them, of course, decides to point out a typo on my resume, or was it a spacing error, one of the two. And I'm like, okay, cool. Yep, that is an error. You called it. Great. I'm not the type of person that would call that out in an interview, but listen, I'm supposed to be having attention to detail, so I guess I missed the mark there. But I got called for the second interview. I was a little bit surprised about that, but I did. And then this is where it starts to get really interesting, because I wasn't nervous about the job or feeling insecure about the job until I got to the second interview. Because as I said, the job description was pretty clear, pretty simple, and I knew that I could do it. But there was something about this second interview that just made me lose it. I started to completely crumble. And it was in part because the people in this interview, and there was another panel interview with more people. I think it was the same two plus another person. And they started to go on and on about this job and throwing out all these words and descriptions and making it seem so complicated. I don't know, it was stuff like complex, visual data management, and you had to have these specialized illustration skills, and they just went on and on. I remember just blanking out and thinking, oh my gosh, this sounds way too hard. This sounds way too much. This is clearly beyond my level of expertise. Here I was going in thinking it was like a basic branding, graphic design job. And they started really going on about I couldn't even follow what they were saying, which maybe should have been my first clue that it was all like bullshit. So I started to crumble though internally. I started to have that feeling of, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. They're never going to hire me. What am I doing here? So imposter syndrome seriously kicked in at this point. And then they said, do we want to see some samples of our printed work? Because at the time they were doing a lot of printed material still. And I said, yeah, sure. So they take me to this back storage room with all these brochures and printed pieces. And I will say, they had nice budgets for this type of work. So the pieces were really nicely executed. And of course, as a designer, you're like, wow, that looks really great. But then they start giving me the actual printed pieces to review. And they were like, yeah, so this is what we're talking about when we were mentioning the, complex visual data and the illustration. And I'm looking down at a brochure, and I was legitimately trying not to laugh. I almost felt like I was on Punk'd or Candid Camera, because I could not believe that what they were describing to me as the job was reflected in this printed piece I was looking at. And it was the most benign bank brochure. And no joke, it had an illustration on it, but it was like a paper airplane. It was the most basic illustration. I mean, I'm not really an illustrator. However, I definitely can create icons and come up with illustrative graphics and infographics. So I'm looking at them, I'm looking down at the brochure, I'm looking at them, and I'm trying to understand that I'm capiching this correctly. This is what they're talking about. And in that moment, it was just the flood goes over you of relief. And then I started having this internal conversation with myself and laughing at myself for being so freaked out and for taking myself out of the game and thinking that I didn't actually have what it took for this job. Now, there was definitely a communication challenge happening, because I'm thinking one thing and they're saying one thing and I was interpreting it one way. But I find it so interesting that we immediately dismiss our abilities and we immediately think that we're not good enough of doing something if we somewhat get overwhelmed or if we're a little bit nervous. And that was definitely what I was doing all the time. And I started to reflect on all the times that I've thought this and taken myself out of the game and assumed that I couldn't do what they were asking for, that it was going to be too complicated, too hard, too much. All those times I didn't believe in myself. And that doubt, the doubt just comes up. It creeps in, and it does feel like a virus taking over your body, and you can't think clearly. You start forgetting about all the things you have accomplished. You forget about all the talents you do have, all the skills you actually have. And I really let myself in that interview be intimidated by these people. I assumed that they knew more than me. They were better than me, maybe better designers than me, better creative thinkers than me. And like, why was I doing this? Why was this my default setting? So this interview, I can tell you that I never went into a job interview the same way after. That's not to say that I haven't gone into job interviews where I clearly was missing a skill set and they went south really quickly. Okay. I've definitely done that. Had those interviews where you think you can do it and then they tell you all that's involved and you quickly realize this is out of my wheelhouse. Like I'm out of my lane. There's a big difference between being completely out of your lane and just slightly out of your comfort zone. So this RBC Dexia job, this was completely in my comfort zone. This was in my lane. Yes, I would have learned a few new things because it was banking and I hadn't done too much in finance other than a bit of freelance work. But there was no reason for me to take myself out of the running and to have been so hard on myself. Now, the next step to this process was getting a third interview. And the third interview was booked, and then something really strange went on. I feel like it might have gone internal. Bottom line is I did not get the third interview and I didn't get the job. There was something weird that happened when I spoke to the recruiter. And she said, yeah, we're having the third interview. Oh, that's what it was. They canceled it last minute. So I actually arrived at the building for my third interview. And then they canceled it, said something about some emergency or one of those lame excuses. And they said they would reschedule it. And then it all kind of fell apart. And at this point, I didn't really care because I felt like the interview served its purpose. I definitely realized that I know more than I think I know, that you know more than you think you know, and we know more than we think we know. Like that was just the bottom line. It was everyone is putting themselves down and assuming they can't do things. And most of the time we can. And we have to get out of the habit of taking ourselves out of the running because 98% of the time you do know more than you think you know. There may be a skill set gap sometimes, and imposter syndrome can kick in when we genuinely have like a deficiency in a skill set and we can't do something. But a lot of the times it's a mindset and it's a story that we're telling ourselves. And we are going into a mental state of struggle because we question our talents. So after this job interview, I never went into a job interview thinking that I couldn't do it. I just assumed that I could. Now, again, sometimes I couldn't actually do the job. It wasn't a great fit. But I decided to believe in myself because if these people thought what they were doing was so fantastic and so complicated and so high level, then that gave me perspective because it was so simplistic in my opinion, and it would have been really easy to execute. So I will now assume that I can do things and I just fill in the blanks as I go along. And that is why I'm so, so grateful for this job interview. And that is really half the battle, is being able to go into a stressful situation like a job interview, thinking that you can do it, having the mindset that you absolutely can execute, that you add value, you can do what's being asked, that you can, especially if you're a creative, that you can come up with the ideas, that you're a great designer, that you can do this. So a few things to do is always check in when you're feeling really insecure and ask yourself, am I overinflating this? Is there a real and true reason I feel so insecure? Or am I just freaking out because I'm stepping into something unknown? And then ask yourself, if there is a legitimate knowledge gap, can you fill it? Can you do something to fill it? Can you take the course? Can you take or up-level a skill? And a side note about that, yes, we sometimes have to learn skills we don't want to for a new job, but pursuing an entire job/career based on having to learn new skills that you really genuinely don't want to learn, you are going to find yourself out of alignment really, really quickly. One of the most important things after this interview was I learned to change the story. I learned to change the story in my head and not tell myself that I couldn't do things and not assume that I couldn't get the job. I was defaulting to not believing in myself. And it was this experience, this weirdo job interview, that helped me realize that I could think differently, I could show up differently, and I absolutely can do hard things or things that are seemingly really hard, because most of the time they're actually not that complicated. There are so many people out there that are trying to make their roles more important, what they do more important, and inflate it and make it be this lofty, highbrow work. And I have worked with so many people like that. I have worked in offices where they're talking and saying the most pedestrian thing and having the most simple insights, and yet they're presenting it like they have just discovered a new solution for hair loss or something crazy, like something that could radically change the world, right? They're talking about it like it's this big thing and it's so, layered and important and complicated. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings or sat in corporate offices and looked at people and thought, I can't believe you are making the sound so complicated or so highbrow when in fact it's pretty simple. So that is what happened in this interview. And I now have a completely different perspective. And so the next time you are going into a job interview, be kind to yourself and try and go in with the mindset that you can do it, that you will know the answers to the questions they ask. I always tell myself that the right answers will always come to me. I have that intention before I go into every job interview for sure. And I trust myself to be able to answer the questions. So looking at self-trust, trusting yourself to be calm in the moment. There's some things you can do, such as deep breathing before you go into an interview. But one thing that is most important is don't take yourself out of the running. Don't talk yourself out of the job. Don't think that you can't do it. Don't think it's too hard, because chances are you can, because you do know more than you think you know. Thank you for joining me today on Ditch the Struggle. You showing up here means so much to me. To dig deeper into the topics discussed today and to learn about my work, visit alanarosa.com. And don't forget to download your free resources while you're there. And if this episode resonated with you, please share with others who also want to ditch the struggle. Go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating and a review, and let me know what you'd like to see more of on this podcast. And before I go, I want to leave you with my 3 favorite ways to ditch the struggle. Be your own best advocate, take baby steps for the win, and forget about a linear career path. It's overrated and you are doing just fine. See you next time.